Welcome to this AI debate on is Trump's December 2025 national security strategy betraying Ukraine and Europe, analyzing the civilizational erasure document and 28-point Russia peace plan, where chatbots explore both sides. We'll begin with opening statements from Betrayal and Pragmatic-Realism. Now, Betrayal.
Since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on 2022-02-24, the credibility of Allied commitments has been the single most important deterrent preventing further expansion. Weakening those commitments risks multiplying crises. Today, I will argue clearly and directly that the December 2025 National Security Strategy and its companion texts amount to a betrayal of Ukraine and European security because they rhetorically and materially erode the very tools that have kept the war from becoming a wider European conflagration. First, by signaling acceptance or accommodation of territorial changes, these documents create explicit pressure on Kyiv to cede land as the price of a negotiated peace, a price that rewards conquest rather than upholding the international rule that borders cannot be reordered by force. That principle is the bedrock of the post-1945 order embodied in the United Nations Charter, and it is not an optional diplomatic posture. Second, the strategy's rhetorical shifts weaken U.S. deterrence and therefore damage NATO credibility by suggesting a reduced willingness to underwrite alliance security guarantees. In turn, that invites revisionist actors to test NATO's cohesion and the value of Article 5 assurances. Third, the NSS and companion rhetoric open political space for rolling back sanctions and scaling back military assistance, measures that have been the primary levers of pressure keeping Russia from converting battlefield gains into permanent political control, and that would materially strengthen Moscow's hand if withdrawn. Fourth, these texts downplay or marginalize international law and human rights obligations tied to territories seized after 2022-02-24, thereby normalizing aggression and creating impunity for abuses that have already triggered investigations by international mechanisms. Fifth, the practical consequences of this shift are not abstract. Reduced deterrence plus lifted or loosened sanctions will accelerate consolidation of Russian control in occupied areas, increase the likelihood of further aggression against Baltic and Central European states, and deepen refugee and humanitarian crises across the continent. Let me unpack each of those claims in turn. When a leading power publicly signals that some territorial changes are negotiable as fait accompli, it removes the cost of conquest, and costs are the only reliable brake against revisionist aggression. The United States and its allies have relied on a mix of weapons, sanctions, and unified diplomatic isolation to impose those costs. If the NSS implies that those instruments are negotiable or temporary, adversaries will interpret that as a green light. The alliance's credibility depends on both capability and will, and words that suggest diminished will are in practice reflationary for risk. The strategy documents also reframe sanctions and assistance as burdensome liabilities rather than necessary tools of statecraft. That reframing is consequential. Sanctions are not symbolic. They constrict finance, technology, and logistics that sustain military operations and occupation, and military aid replenishes the means for a victim state to regain leverage at the negotiating table. Weakening these levers before Ukraine secures meaningful reversals means negotiations will be driven by Moscow's gains, not by enforceable Ukrainian sovereignty. The moral and legal dimensions cannot be separated from the strategic ones. International criminal investigations and monitoring have documented serious abuses in territories seized since 2022. Treating those territories as legitimate bargaining chips corrodes accountability and signals to perpetrators that territorial conquest can shield them from scrutiny. Humanitarian indicators are already dire. Millions displaced internally and abroad, strained host communities, and long-term reconstruction needs that will swell if occupation solidifies, all reasons to sustain pressure rather than reward conquest. Finally, the broader geopolitical spillovers matter. If a major democracy signals it will trade security guarantees for short-term deals, authoritarian states take note. China, in particular, watches how the West responds to breaches of the territorial status quo because those precedents shape its calculus elsewhere. An NSS that normalizes territorial revision will not stabilize Europe. It will make great power competition messier, more dangerous, and more likely to produce cascading crises. I expect the counter-argument to be that negotiation is pragmatic and that peace now saves lives. Negotiation is indeed a legitimate tool, but negotiating from a position where the aggressor's gains are privileged and deterrent capacity is atrophied is capitulation, not diplomacy. A fair, enforceable peace requires Ukrainian leverage backed by credible deterrence and allied unity. That means maintaining sanctions, sustaining military aid, reinforcing NATO assurances, and insisting that any settlement reverses annexation and respects international law. In short, words must be matched by tools. A strategy that rhetorically or materially accommodates conquest risks converting a temporary wartime fact into a permanent geopolitical order. Defending Ukraine's sovereignty and preserving European security demands clarity of law, unity of purpose, and persistence of pressure.
Now, pragmatic realism. As the old realist adage holds, politics is the art of the possible, and sometimes the possible is protecting people and strategic balance through enforceable bargains rather than permanent escalation. My position is straightforward. The December 2025 National Security Strategy, the controversial civilizational erasure critique, and the accompanying 28-point proposal should not be caricatured as betrayal. Viewed pragmatically, they represent a deliberate effort to protect core U.S. interests, reduce the risk of catastrophic escalation, and create a pathway out of a costly, open-ended conflict. These proposals aim to lock in commitments that are verifiable and reversible where necessary, not to reward aggression or abandon principles, but to make concrete what peace and security would actually look like on the ground. First, the central virtue of the strategy is preventing direct great power confrontation, including the heightened risk of nuclear escalation, by prioritizing calibrated deterrence and diplomacy over unbounded proxy warfare. The literature on coercion and bargaining teaches us that when two nuclear-armed powers confront one another, restraint and carefully managed channels for negotiation reduce the likelihood of miscalculation that can cascade into catastrophe. This is not a sentimental choice. It is a sober risk assessment about the difference between a manageable contest and an uncontrollable spiral. The practical measures that follow from that assessment include preserving secure lines of military communication, agreed escalation ladders, and third-party verification so that warning signs do not become triggers for irreversible responses. Second, the documents reflect hard fiscal and resource realities. Prolonged, open-ended military commitments impose mounting economic, human, and industrial strains that erode both domestic support and the capacity to compete elsewhere. European and global defense postures have shifted since 2022, and sustaining extremely high levels of military aid and mobilization indefinitely would crowd out investments needed to compete strategically in theaters such as the Indo-Pacific. Those strains show up in supply chain bottlenecks, stressed defense production lines, and the political limits of sustained conscription or mobilization. Realities that policymakers cannot ignore without risking strategic overreach. Third, diplomacy with verifiable, enforceable guarantees can secure durable outcomes without abandoning principles. History shows that negotiated settlements, when properly structured, can end bloodshed and lock in fragile but enforceable peace terms. The Dayton Framework for Bosnia is an example of complex multinational verification and phased implementation that stabilized a brutal conflict after years of war. Drawing lessons from such agreements, a responsible approach today would insist on phased security arrangements, multilateral monitoring, transparent verification mechanisms, and sanctions relief only tied to verifiable Russian steps, not vague promises. Fourth, the rhetorical language in the so-called civilizational erasure critique should be interpreted in context as a negotiating posture and a warning about zero-sum ideological framing rather than a White House endorsement of criminal acts. Diplomatic language can be blunt to create bargaining room and to sharpen the costs and consequences that will be enforced if bad actors do not comply. Bluntness does not equal abandonment of accountability. Fifth, to those who charge betrayal because any negotiation requires compromise, I say this. Negotiation with allies and with Kiev's voluntary consent is not capitulation
if it secures concrete protections, binding security guarantees, phased and reversible sanctions relief tied to independent verification, permanent mechanisms for arms control or demilitarized zones where appropriate, and a continuing role for international courts and accountability processes. Any credible deal must be multinational, worthwhile to Ukraine, and enforceable by collective action rather than dependent on unilateral goodwill. Sixth, the strategy pragmatically rebalances U.S. attention and resources to meet other strategic challenges while still preserving European security through burden sharing and NATO reassurance measures. Strengthening European defense capacities, accelerating interoperable capabilities, and tying relief to enforceable benchmarks all reduce the chance that the United States alone will be drawn into an escalating ground logic that neither our forces nor our economy can sustain long term. Seventh, public and political limits matter for policy durability. Strategies that ignore domestic constraints risk producing one-off escalations followed by rapid retrenchment, which ultimately weakens deterrence and abandons partners at worse moments. A candid, enforceable diplomatic track that includes Kiev's leadership as a co-negotiator is more likely to produce a durable bargain than endless depletion of resources without clear end states. In closing, realism here is not cynicism. Protecting core interests, preventing nuclear escalation, shielding civilians from further suffering, preserving NATO cohesion, and maintaining the capacity to meet other long-term strategic challenges requires bargaining with teeth, allied buy-in, and rigorous verification, not theatrical moral purity that cannot be enforced. A pragmatic realist path asks of us tough trade-offs, but those trade-offs are the difference between a negotiated peace that saves lives and a permanent war that eats away at our strength and leaves Europe and Ukraine more vulnerable in the longer run.
Now, let's hear the first rebuttals from Betrayal and Pragmatic-Realism. Now, Betrayal.
You say negotiation is realism. I agree that diplomacy matters, but realism also requires clarity about power and consequences. The December 2025 National Security Strategy and its companion texts do not simply open a pragmatic channel, they shift the bargaining chips off the table. If the goal is to produce an enforceable peace, then the document must do two things in plain language: explicitly preserve Ukraine's territorial integrity and bind allied leverage, sanctions, military aid, and collective guarantees, to concrete benchmarks that only reverse when occupation ends. Where in the December 2025 language are those clauses? Which paragraphs commit the United States to sustain sanctions until annexations are reversed? Which lines strengthen Article 5 assurances rather than qualifying them? Ask your interlocutor for the clauses. If they cannot show them, we are no longer discussing negotiation, we are describing concession. Treating occupied territory as negotiable is not neutral bargaining, it normalizes conquest. That is a legal and moral problem. The prohibition on acquiring land by force is a basic rule of the post-1945 order. To bargain away territory is to erode that rule and to invite other revisionist actors to test the limits. Practically, the document's rhetorical accommodation reduces Ukrainian leverage. Fewer weapons, ambiguous sanctions relief, and murky guarantees all make Kyiv more likely to accept painful territorial concessions. Deterrence is not an abstract concept. It is the concrete expectation that aggression will be costly. When Washington signals a willingness to dilute costs, deterrence weakens across the theater, from Kyiv to the Baltic capitals. Consider the geopolitical ripple effects. A strategy that appears to legitimize territorial grabs will embolden not only Moscow, but other authoritarian states that watch whether conquest produces lasting gains. That increases risks in the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, and Central Europe, and it makes refugee flows and humanitarian crises more likely. It also fractures the moral authority the United States and NATO need to hold coalitions together. Alliances are built on trust that commitments will be upheld, not reinterpreted when it becomes politically convenient. Pragmatism requires leverage, not capitulation. A credible alternative is straightforward. keep sanctions tied to reversal of annexations, sustain and calibrate military assistance so Ukraine can negotiate from strength, strengthen NATO forward defenses, and clear Article 5 language, and require any sanctions relief be phased, reversible, and verified by impartial multilateral mechanisms, with war crimes accountability preserved. That is hard bargaining. It is not abandonment. The December 2025 texts, as currently framed, force a choice: preserve the rules-based order by matching words with durable tools, or legitimize conquest and watch deterrence unravel. Which will you defend?
Now, pragmatic realism.
I agree with my opponent on the moral core. Defending sovereignty and holding aggressors accountable are non-negotiable obligations. But moral clarity does not resolve a tactical question we face right now. Is perpetual escalation the only way to secure those goods, or can disciplined, enforceable diplomacy preserve them while reducing the risk of catastrophic escalation? Their argument treats negotiation as synonymous with capitulation, yet that is a false choice. Negotiation can be a means of locking in durable, verifiable security outcomes rather than an elegant way to reward conquest. Consider the practical problem they raise about signaling acceptance of territorial change. That risk is real only if an agreement simply rubber stamps conquest. It is avoided if arrangements are explicitly conditional, phased, and reversible. For example, demilitarized zones monitored by multinational forces, time-bound security guarantees, and snapback sanctions tied to objective verification. Those measures preserve leverage while protecting civilians from ongoing combat. On deterrence and NATO credibility, they assume deterrence equals endless expenditure and unbounded commitment. Credibility is capability plus clear political thresholds. If the United States commits to interoperable surge forces, rapid reinforcement plans, and near-term European capability increases, and if those are linked to clear political consequences for violations, then deterrence can be maintained without an open-ended drain on American capacity. Their critique about sanctions and aid withdrawal is right to flag danger, but it misunderstands sequencing. Sanctions relief can be structured as a reward for verifiable steps, not an unconditional gift. Phase sanctions relaxation with independent monitoring and automatic reinstatement clauses is a way to make peace durable rather than premature. On accountability, diplomacy and justice are complements, not substitutes. Any negotiated roadmap must explicitly preserve international criminal processes and ensure evidence protection. Cooperation can be a precondition for relief and recognition, not a substitute. Finally, they raise the specter of wider escalation if Western resolve appears weak. The sharper risk, in my view, is uncontrolled escalation driven by miscalculation, including nuclear risks, if competition spirals without diplomatic outlets. A strategy that prioritizes enforceable benchmarks, allied burden sharing, Ukrainian consent, and multilateral verification reduces both the humanitarian toll and the chance that a regional war widens into a great power catastrophe. To those who say negotiation will betray values, I ask, would you prefer an endless war that exhausts our alliances and leaves grievances unresolved, or a credibly enforced settlement that protects civilians now, preserves Ukraine's sovereignty as a future legal and diplomatic objective, and keeps the alliance ready to punish any violation? The debate should be about how to construct that enforcement architecture, not an absolutist choice between permanent war and moral purity.
Moving on to the second rebuttals. Now, betrayal.
You insist that a negotiated settlement can be enforceable and humane, but that argument depends entirely on specific language and credible enforcement, not on vague promises. Where exactly in the December 2025 texts are the clauses that lock in Ukraine's territorial integrity, mandate that sanctions remain until annexations are reversed, and strengthen Article 5 rather than qualify it? If those provisions exist, readers deserve to hear their paragraph numbers and trigger mechanisms. If they cannot be produced, we are no longer discussing disciplined diplomacy. We are witnessing a reallocation of bargaining chips away from the defenders and toward the aggressor. Let me be blunt about what is at stake. First, the legal and moral frame. Treating occupied territory as negotiable without clear, reversible conditions corrodes the post-1945 rule that territory cannot be acquired by force. That is not abstract rhetoric. It is the difference between protecting populations under international law and normalizing conquest. Bargaining over someone else's land without ironclad, verifiable conditions is a moral abdication. Second, deterrence and leverage matter. The single most reliable way to keep further aggression from happening has been credible allied unity backed by sanctions, military assistance, and the expectation of sustained costs. When words in a strategy dilute those expectations, when relief is hinted at without benchmarks, when commitments are made ambiguous, you do not create room for better diplomacy. You shrink the leverage that makes diplomacy possible. Ask, which elements of the December 2025 package increase Kiev's bargaining power? If the answer is only monitoring or phased relief without timelines, trigger clauses, and rapid snapback, that's euphemism for rollback. Third, the geopolitical cascade is real. When a great power appears to secure gains through force and then sees those gains normalized, other revisionist states learn a lesson. Aggression can be rewarded. That raises the odds of destabilization in the Baltics, Central Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, and it multiplies humanitarian crises and refugee flows across the continent. I concede negotiation is necessary. I reject the premise that negotiation must start by weakening the defender. A better course is clear. Keep sanctions tied to reversal of annexations, continue calibrated military aid so Ukraine can negotiate from strength, harden NATO assurances with explicit operational commitments, and make any relief verifiable, phased, and instantly reversible. Preserve international criminal accountability as non-negotiable. That is not maximalism. It is realism with teeth. The choice is simple. Match words with durable tools and defend the rules-based order, or offer de facto recognition of conquest and watch deterrence and alliances unravel. Which history do we want to write?
Now, pragmatic realism.
I agree with my opponent on the moral bottom line. Standing for sovereignty and punishing aggression is non-negotiable. That said, the heart of our dispute is tactical, not moral. They insist that anything short of unconditional military victory equals betrayal. I reject that false binary. The practical question is whether perpetual escalation, open-ended spending, endless risk of wider war, and the growing prospect of catastrophic miscalculation actually secures those moral goods, or whether disciplined, enforceable diplomacy can lock them in without trading them away. Consider three core themes: reversibility, deterrence, and accountability. On reversibility, the risk my opponent fears, legal normalization of annexation, is real only if any deal simply ratifies territorial change. That is avoidable. Properly constructed agreements can be explicitly conditional and reversible. Demilitarized zones with multinational battalions, time-bound security arrangements, and independent verification mechanisms keep pathways open for restoration of sovereignty while halting immediate civilian slaughter. Freezing a line today with verification preserves leverage tomorrow. On deterrence, their argument treats credibility as theater, loud promises and perpetual shipments. Credibility is capability plus clear political thresholds. If the United States and NATO commit to interoperable surge forces, pre-positioned reinforcements, accelerated European defense production, and automatic political consequences for violations, deterrence endures without bankrupting our capacity to address rivals elsewhere. Ask them, what specific, sustainable plan do they offer for a decade of unlimited support that allies will finance and voters will tolerate? On accountability, diplomacy and justice are complements. Any negotiated roadmap can and must preserve international criminal processes, protect evidence, and make cooperation a precondition for phased relief. Sanctions relaxation need not be a blanket amnesty, but a reversible, conditional reward tied to verifiable steps. My opponent worries about emboldening other autocrats. The opposite risk is uncontrolled escalation, nuclear signaling, miscalculation, regional spillover, that a strategy of pure militarization heightens. A prudent NSS posture aims to reduce those risks while building enforceable multilateral tools, snapback sanction clauses, pooled allied enforcement, NATO reassurance packages, and European burden sharing to finance defense industrial ramp-ups. Finally, remember Ukrainian agency. No credible settlement is unilateral. Kyiv must consent to any arrangement. Any deal without their buy-in is illegitimate. So the right standard is not whether talks occur, but whether agreements are reversible, verified, allied, and anchored in accountability. I concede that the texts my opponent criticizes raise legitimate alarms. The right response is to convert those alarms into precise demands: binding verification, phased benchmarks, allied enforcement, and clear Article 5 reaffirmations, not to reject negotiation out of hand. As we move to closing, I will show how those implementation details transform a politically fraught strategy into a realistic safeguard for lives, alliances, and long-term rules-based order.
Finally, the closing statements from both sides. Now, betrayal.
The December 2025 National Security Strategy and its companion texts are not prudent diplomacy. They are a strategic retreat that effectively cushions conquest. By reframing a negotiated endgame without insisting on reversal of annexations. By elevating the language of the civilizational erasure critique alongside a 28-point plan that pressures Kyiv to trade land for peace. These documents remove the leverage that has sustained deterrence since Russia's full-scale invasion. The practical result will be consolidation of Russian control in Ukraine, a green light to other authoritarian actors, heightened risk to Baltic and Central European states, and a deepening humanitarian catastrophe, all while U.S. credibility and NATO cohesion erode. Negotiation is necessary, but negotiation from weakness is capitulation. A just, enforceable peace requires Ukrainian leverage backed by sanctions, military assistance, and ironclad allied guarantees. The better path is clear. Maintain targeted pressure, strengthen NATO assurances, demand restoration of sovereignty as the basis for talks, and share the burden with allies. Choose deterrence and principle over concession and consequence.
Now, pragmatic realism.
Ask yourself what betrayal actually looks like. Abandoning principle, turning our backs on allies, or pursuing a sober strategy to prevent a wider, deadlier war while protecting enduring interests. The December 2025 texts are not surrender. They are a roadmap that seeks enforceable, verifiable bargains, phased security arrangements, multilateral monitoring, sanctions relief tied to clear steps, and they insist Kyiv's consent. Yes, moral clarity matters, and I conceded that, but morality also demands prudent stewardship of lives, resources, and the nuclear risks of escalation. The phrase civilizational erasure reads like a negotiating posture, strong rhetoric, not an endorsement of impunity, and the 28-point plan channels diplomacy toward concrete guarantees rather than open-ended military entanglement. If we want lasting security for Ukraine and Europe, we should back a strategy that combines verification, allied burden sharing, and Ukrainian agency. Pragmatism that secures peace and preserves deterrence is not betrayal, it is responsible leadership.